Welcome back to Software Development Practices. We're going to start the day off by looking at the end of those test-driven development slides again, and then we're going to get into Scrum, which is one of my favorite concepts in Agile development because everybody thinks it's stupid until they do it, and then they might still think it's stupid. But you're obligated not to. Anyway, let's get right into it. Let's start with test-driven development. We'll start with we'll go one slide back and we'll start with test automation. What did you all learn about test automation? Well, first of all, you learned that people suck at writing automated tests. It's really hard. It's really hard to write good ones. It's really easy to write an automated test that can be trivially defeated. Assert x equals 15. X equals 15 on the line before that. Test passed. Would that get you kicked out of a regular company? Would that get you kicked off a dev team? It might. It might not. I don't know. You passed the test. I guess it really depends on what your management is like. But if you were a really bad faith, unskilled programmer, you could do quite a bit of damage while still passing all of the test cases. So, yeah, tests are tough. And I hope you learned how difficult it is to write automated tests in the first place, which is why test-driven development is usually something that you need to develop the skills for over quite a long time, and it's very difficult to do even in practice. So if test-driven development is something that you want to do in your career, start thinking in a more testing mindset, because from what I could tell, none of you are very good at thinking in that testing mindset. And again, it is really difficult to think, given this input, what should this function or what should this entire class kind of do? That's a very hard mindset to be in. It's also not an unhelpful mindset to master. All right, programmers often prefer programming to testing. Did you learn that? I think most of you did. Most of you, even when you were tasked to write tests, couldn't help yourselves. You wrote some programming anyway. Now, sometimes you wrote those programming extra lines in order to get the tests to work or to do something different, but many of you actually wrote, oh, you're right, okay, boost my gain, woo, loud microphone, is that better, audio-wise? Let me know if that's not an improvement. Yep, all right, cool. So yeah, many of you learned that programming is much more fun than testing, and you're going to end up writing programs anyway. Many of you wrote a very incomplete test that didn't check for all the possible exceptions. You wrote the lowest hanging fruit. Many of you did not write your tests incrementally. So it's very hard to write unit tests for the code that implements the display logic and the workflow between scenes. The workflow between scenes part, or the part where classes interact, absolutely slaughtered pretty much everybody, right? Almost nobody came up with any good tests for the interaction between two or more elements, because it's really difficult. So, test-driven development, hard stuff. I guess that's all I want to say there. All right, now let's talk about pair programming a little, which I briefly touched on last time. So pair programming was developed, I think, around the 90s, so Agile's been around for a bit when pair programming becomes an idea. And pair programming is basically two people share one mouse and keyboard. One of them typically takes the role of the driver, and the other person takes the role of, sometimes it's called an observer, sometimes it's called a mentor, sometimes it's called a guide, sometimes it's called a navigator. But one person's typing and using the mouse, the other person is just talking to the person who's doing the work. Many of you just do this normally when you work in groups. You do a form of pair programming, or what some people would refer to as group programming, where you have one mouse and keyboard for many people. Many Agile proponents consider this to be a good idea because it's basically an informal review process. You get two minds. My personal impression of it is very negative. I find that the code that comes out of pair programming is garbage most of the time. And I'm also very negative on pair programming because when it started getting repopularized let's say in the early 2010s or so, a lot of the articles that promoted pair programming were promoting it as a mechanism for bringing diversity into the computer science field by taking these people who are unskilled and making them type while their mentor tells them what to type. And that always sounded pretty stupid to me. The idea of having somebody type what somebody else tells them sounds like the least effective mechanism for development, and the idea that somebody needs someone over their shoulder to review them to be a valuable employee is about peak condescension, my opinion. So you can think of it as you like, and if you want to do pair programming, there are many companies that will allow you to do so. You will generally switch roles too at the good places, or at least you won't be stuck in the typing mouse and keyboard driver's seat the entire time. Hopefully, as you earn more seniority, you actually spend time in the observing seat, which is arguably the harder one. But for me, I hate it. So just something to watch out for on your job applications. If you like it, ask if the company you're interviewing at does it. If you don't like it, ask if the company you're interviewing at does it. Because if this isn't something you want to do, you do not want to be stuck at a place that does it, because they're going to do it constantly. Pair programming, programmers sit together at the same computer to develop software. Pairs are created dynamically. That means that sometimes the pairs will rotate, so you'll get different mentors, different people in the driver's seat. There's this implied sharing of knowledge, and it is really nice as a mentoring experience to communicate things that maybe the person in the driver's seat doesn't know how to do. According to Somerville, it's not necessarily inefficient, and there is some evidence that suggests that a pair working together is more efficient than two programmers working separately. And note the very hand-wavy some evidence. Okay, well that brings us to the main point of today, which is Agile project management. The principal responsibility of software project managers is to manage the project so that the software is delivered on time and within the planned budget. Most of you are already over budget and behind schedule, but you can do as close to this as possible. Now, the standard approach to project management is to plan. Managers draw up a plan, show it will be delivered, when it'll be delivered. This is really hard to do for software, right? Agile project management requires a different approach. Like everything else in the Agile process, it's iterative, and as we go through the next few weeks, as we get into this implementation phase in earnest, we're going to be as agile as possible. So we've done a lot of planning before this, and as you have seen up to this point, the planning that we've done is all but useless, and that is true of most planning. So everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face or they have to start developing software. Agile throws the plan in the bin and makes the plan iteratively, and it has the same approach to management, and that's where I want you to be at for the rest of the semester. So to an extent, everything you've done so far is a cautionary tale, but as well as being a cautionary tale, it also represents much of the workload that you would have during the Agile process. You would still be required to drill up your requirements, your design, your validation document. And as we go through this process, you are still required to maintain your requirements, your design, your validation document, your UML diagrams, etc. Okay, so on to Scrum itself. What is Scrum? Scrum is an agile method that focuses on managing iterative development. That's a very fancy phrasing, isn't it? And indeed, if you look up what Scrum is, you will get a lot of similar fancy phrasing. There is a lot of mythology around Scrum. Scrum is almost religious in its execution. 3 phases in Scrum. The initial phase is an outline planning phase where you establish the general objectives for the project and design the software architecture. Pretty straightforward, but kind of ironic that we start with planning again, isn't it? Followed by a series of sprint cycles. Sprint is an important word to know in the Scrum nomenclature. A sprint is a development cycle, basically, in Scrum that develops an increment of the system. So we plan our sprints, then we execute them, then we do some more planning, and before we do some more planning, we have a closure phase that wraps up the project, completes the documentation, because it's not done until it's documented, and maybe makes the user manual, assesses some lesson learned, etc. Let's look at some more Scrum terms. First, we got the dev team. No more than 7 people. Another big thing about Agile development is that it's a small team-based process. That means that most of the organizations that you will go to work for since most of the industry is agile today. Even though the organization might be dozens, hundreds, or thousands of software engineers, the team that you work with day to day will typically be no more than 7 people, and those 7 people might rotate, and you might go to different teams very frequently, but at any given point there will usually not be too many people in your bubble. This is basically essential to making sure that the tribe doesn't get so big as the communication tends to break down as groups become larger than that. So we tend to have a hard time dealing with large groups. So what you're experiencing in this class, these groups of 5, is very typical of the kind of development team that you might be in. But groups that small can't complete large projects, obviously. So the first step in Agile is a lot like what you did in the design phase, where the project is broken up into its development view and the different parts can be assigned to development teams. So that's an important step. Now in this case, all of you obviously work on all the different parts, and breaking it down into further teams would be unnecessary. But in a very large project, you can understand how difficult it is to break a very large project up into teams of 7 or fewer people. So you got your dev team. The dev team develops the software, other project documents. That's you. There's the potentially shippable project increment, the software increment that's delivered at the end of a sprint. At the end of every sprint, we should have something that is in a finished state. It works, it passes our tests, and it can be incorporated into the final product. Obviously, that's not always possible in practice, but every increment should give us something. So your sprints, as we go through this development phase, should be about 1 week long because we have a pretty short development cycle. So try to get something done at the end of every sprint. We'll start basically the first sprint next class, so Tuesday, and then we'll go from there. The product backlog. This is basically a list of your to-do features, which the Scrum team must tackle. You don't have to maintain this just because I'm already making you do a lot of other documentation to boot, but generally Scrum teams will have some sort of either a document or a whiteboard where their to-do items are listed. And a lot of the time, because it's Agile, these are described rather than as text, as maybe a UML diagram, a user story, or just pulling something from the requirements document and saying, this is our to-do for this week, we're going to satisfy this requirement. It can be as simple as that. The product owner is not necessarily the person who owns it financially. It's an individual or maybe a group whose job it is to identify the product features. This is a buzzword that's become slightly less popular, but you'll still hear a lot. Ownership in general is a very popular buzzword in business today. Ownership means who is responsible for it. So this is basically a synonym for responsibility in business speak. When we say that you need to take ownership for this task, it means it's your job now, you're responsible for it. And this is ownership in that same sense. It's basically whose responsibility is this product. And sometimes the owner can be a customer, but it also might be a project manager, or it might be some other stakeholder who is ultimately the owner. And of course, responsibility is obviously shared, and at the end of the day, it all goes back on your company as a whole, and all of you individually will suffer if the project does badly, so it's kind of a weird abstraction to begin with. So what is a Scrum, the Scrum? He, she, we Scrum, they Scrum, we all Scrum. A Scrum is the daily meeting of the Scrum team that reviews the progress and prioritizes the work to be done that day. So for the rest of the semester after today, you will have to do a daily Scrum. Now this is generally a face-to-face meeting, but because of the pandemic, we are not face-to-face, and I think the Agile development proponents would forgive us for that. So a lot of people also call this the daily stand-up, although there are sometimes some distinctions between stand-up and Scrum. The reason people call it a stand-up, anybody can guess? It's because you have to stay standing. Why do you stay standing? Because the software developers can't stand for more than 15 minutes at a time, which means the meeting gets to wrap up quickly. And that is essentially the reason in reality. All right, so the Scrum Master is the person who's responsible for making sure the Scrum team is on track. They are following the guides. They are making effective use of their time. They are not bantering and talking about other things during the Scrum. They end the Scrum meeting as well. They are the interface between the Scrum team and the rest of the company, so oftentimes they will also be the team manager, but not always, and oftentimes they will be the customer liaison, but not always. The Scrum developers are adamant that the Scrum Master should be not thought of as the product manager, because he's not always the project manager. He or she may very well be just another team member, but they are still responsible for keeping the Scrum meeting on track. In practice, though, it is typically somebody with authority, because otherwise you can't actually enforce keeping the team on track, but in teams that work well together, it could be anybody. And in teams that work very well together, the role of the Scrum Master is minimal, since everybody should stay on track anyway. So your goal is to be at a company where the Scrum Master does little more than schedule the meetings, but keep in mind that the Scrum Master is nominally responsible for making sure that everyone's not distracted, the meeting stays on track, all that other good stuff as well. A sprint, again, is a development iteration. Somerville says sprints are usually 2 to 4 weeks long, and that's relatively accurate industry-wise, but since we have a very short development cycle, a sprint would be the whole thing, so I want you guys to keep your sprints around a week, even though that's probably considered pretty breakneck. Velocity is an estimate of how much of the product backlog a team can cover in a single sprint. So the better your team is, the faster they are, and the faster they can complete their sprint. These terms all tie together so well. Understanding a team's velocity helps them estimate what can be covered in a sprint and provides a basis for measuring or improving performance. So I want you guys to achieve a velocity of at least 6. 6 what, you ask? 6. The Scrum sprint cycle. Review the work. Where does it start? Where does it start, Somerville? I'm going to start here at review sprint. Review work to be done. Update our product backlog. Select some items from the backlog that we're going to do in this sprint. So we're going to plan the sprint by picking items from our backlog. Which requirements are we going to focus on today? What user stories are we going to make the product do today? Then we're going to sprint. That's going to update our sprint backlog as we go, and at the end of the sprint we have completed some feature, we've removed something from our backlog, and now we have potentially shippable software. We've made an iteration on our product. Sprints are fixed length, normally 2 to 4 weeks. The starting point for planning is the product backlog. You can think of your requirements document for now as the backlog, since you've done none of them yet. So that might be one way you want to do it. If you want to track a backlog, that would probably be a good idea too. It's good practice. The selection phase involves all of the project team who work with the customer to select the features and functionality from the product backlog to be developed during the sprint. How do you pick which features you're going to do? You pick the most important ones first, generally speaking. So again, we're going towards this goal. It wasn't as popular in 2014 when these slides were written, but it's a big buzzword today, the minimum viable product, the MVP. We're always trying to achieve the MVP first. What is the least that we can do that satisfies the customer's most important goals? And then we're going to add features basically in order of importance. So try to get to an MVP first and then add features in the order of importance that you find them in. The sprint cycle. Once these are agreed, the teams organize themselves to develop the software. During this stage, the team is isolated from the customer. Okay, so generally you only have one person on the team, the liaison, or the Scrum Master, who is often that liaison, communicating with the customer and passing that information on to the team. You can feel free to talk to me one-on-one if you want to follow this exactly. The role of the Scrum Master is to protect the development team from distractions. That includes the customer, who is a distracting person indeed most of the time. And at the end of the sprint, the work done is reviewed and presented to stakeholders. In practice, almost no organization will do any serious introspection at the end of a sprint, because people who are sprinting every week don't tend to slow down and review. No, it's hard to justify the business value of sitting down and reviewing what you've done for the last 2 weeks. So that typically is a short and sweet phase. The Scrum Master is a facilitator who arranges daily meetings, tracks the backlog of work to be done, records decisions, measures progress against the backlog, communicates with customers and management outside the team. Sounds like a lot. Really isn't. The whole team attends short daily meetings, so every class period, again, you'll have a Scrum, where all team members share information, describe their progress since the last meeting, problems that have arisen, and what is planned. So every person should adjust 3 points during every daily Scrum. What you've done since last time, what you plan to do in the future, so today basically, and what problems have arisen, what are your impediments to completing your tasks for the day. So what you've done, what you're doing today, and what are your tasks, what are your impediments to the tasks that you plan to do that day. The product is broken down into manageable and understandable chunks. Unstable requirements don't hold up your progress because you can just sprint through them and make them over again later if you end up finding out that your requirements weren't quite up to par. Or you can just work on a different feature until you've nailed them down. The whole team have visibility of everything because every morning you talk to your team and you know what everybody is doing that day and you know what everybody did the day previously. That has a lot of value. Customers see on-time delivery of increments. Customers can sometimes attend Scrum meetings, generally just as observers, but that's probably not common. However, the customer is usually talked to at least once during every sprint to update them on the progress of their application. And trust between the customers and developers is established. A positive culture is created in which everyone expects the project to succeed, and there are rainbows and unicorns, and it rains sprinkles. That's all I've got for today. I'll let you get into it. Today you need to assign some roles. Somebody needs to take Scrum Master and Team Leader. I've written how those will work in the assignment, and I will come and visit you and answer any questions you might have. So see you in Discord.